Hello, everyone. We will get started here in just another moment. Welcome. Okay, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Um, we are really glad to be with you. We've been working on what we're going to be talking with you today, along with Casey Family Programs and Chapin Hall. Those of us at Corporation for Supportive Housing, or CSH, are really excited that you all have joined us for this national webinar that's really looking at the intersections of housing and child welfare. And today we're going to focus on pathways to supportive services specifically that can complement housing stability as a key economic and concrete support for families and young people that have involvement or impacted by child welfare or at risk of. And we certainly know that in this current context of child welfare and housing, there's a lot of ideas and strategies that have been deployed for solving some of the barriers that are in place for both families, children, and young people to be able to access housing and remain in housing, especially when they've been impacted by child welfare. At the same time, we hear that there are challenges, and many of those include the lack of housing that's affordable. We all have seen rents that are escalating, landlords that may not be willing to accept assistance, just challenges in being able to navigate the landscape and the other needs that children, youth, and families have. Um, and we also know that there are a number of economic and concrete supports that children, youth, and families really need that would allow them to not only access and stay in housing, but to really stay together and move to a place of thriving. So today we're really hoping to be able to elevate and share some learning that has been emerging, opportunities and practices that can help create uh, the funding and align across systems to be able to deliver the types of services and supports that children, youth, and families really need. And in our time today, we're going to first, actually, before I get there, want to just mention that in our webinar today, we are going to later on have a time where we will be interacting with today's panelists. And so we encourage you in Zoom to use the Q&A function, which you can see on your menu in Zoom. And you can pose your questions for panelists there. We also wanted to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded, and we will be sharing after the recording and links that you'll be seeing throughout the presentation today. If you need closed captioning, there's options on the Zoom menu, as well as live interpretation. All right, so next, just wanted to introduce you for a moment to our organization at CSH. So the Corporation for Supportive Housing, we are a national nonprofit organization that advances supportive housing as an approach that really helps people thrive. And we are both working on advancing the housing pieces as well as the services and supports. And we do this through advocating for effective policies and funding, equitably investing in communities, and really working to strengthen the supportive housing field and as we connect across sectors. And in our session would not be possible today without the support of Casey Family Programs, our lead partner in our our webinar today, and they are the nation's largest operating foundation focused on safely reducing the need for foster care in the United States. And then also Chapin Hall, an independent policy and research center focused on improving the lives um, of children, youth, and families. And of course, CSH. So as we move forward, we encourage each of you to let us know who's here and let your colleagues know who's here by introducing yourselves in the chat. So I'll just pause for a moment and let folks start introducing themselves and give you a moment to take a look at the chat. You can activate the chat again on your menu at the bottom. And I'd also like to start with introductions of some of the panelists that you're going to be hearing from today. So I'll start with myself. I'm Andrew Johnson. I'm Director of Systems Transformation for Families and Youth at the Corporation for Supportive Housing. I use he, him pronouns, and am glad to be helping move us through our time together today. And then would love to introduce a few of my colleagues from CSH that will be joining, and then I'll move to Chapin Hall. So Teresa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. Teresa Tenori here, and I am based in Seattle, and I work for CSH, and happy to be here today.
All right. Amy?
Hi, everybody. Amy Stutzel, based in Minnesota. I'm the Upper Midwest Director for CSH. Looking forward to talking with you all today.
Great. Kara, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey folks, I'm Kara Mergel. I'm our Director for Policy and Government Affairs. I'll be answering all your questions in the chat and Q&A today. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Kara. And then there's a couple more colleagues that you'll probably be interacting with in the chat as well. And then I would invite Claire Anderson from Chapin Hall. Introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Claire Anderson. I'm a senior policy fellow at Chapin Hall and just delighted to be in partnership here today with CSH, and all of you all. Thank you for having me. I'm just excited about this discussion.
Excellent. So as we move ahead, we are going to be kind of moving through a conversation today. Certainly in our limited time together, we won't be able to get into every detail of every possible, component of services and supports for children, youth, and families. But we do hope that in our time together that we'll be able to provide you with some recommendations and steps that you can take when you leave. We're going to be moving through some rationale and evidence related to housing and child welfare and services, and sharing some information on funding streams and kind of the multi-systems elements that can be leveraged to advance services with housing. And we're going to drill down a little bit further into 3 specific areas of opportunity, including temporary aid to needy families, Medicaid, and Family First Prevention Service Act, and Title 4E of the Social Security Act, which is in the child welfare funding bucket. And then we'll be looking at some jurisdictions experiences woven into our discussion, allowing some time for interaction with our panelists today with your questions, and again, kind of coming back to some of these recommendations that we have based on what we've seen. So hopefully that will at least tee up some opportunities for you all to move things ahead. So let's start by looking at some recommendations that we have. And again, as we move through our time today, you will see aspects of recommendations. Sorry, just one second. So really first is about getting to know each other. really being able to connect and learn about other sectors, systems, and agencies. Being able to dive in and understand what else might be going on, what opportunities might exist, being able to increase coordination opportunities, and really leaning into other systems where there might be eligibility across the populations that you're serving of children, youth, and families. The next recommendation is really about working inclusively. So really identifying and addressing some of the root causes of systems involvement with families and young people, working to try to lessen what is loaded on to families and young people from navigating our systems and some of the administrative pieces, looking at some of the differences between poverty and neglect, and really being able to listen, ask people what they need in a non-intrusive way, and be able to respond. Next really is about making the dollars work for you, leveraging and prioritizing state and federal and even local funding. And again, today we're going to specifically look at Medicaid, TANF, and Title IV-E prevention services. Being able to kind of understand what will it take to be able to leverage these resources? What are the requirements and kind of the paradigms across different funding streams? How might funding be able to be aligned or blended together? And what are some of the rules that would allow you to be creative in the work that you're doing? Next is really about being able to identify the housing needs, whether it's housing instability, experiences of homelessness, but being able to really identify the needs at the time they're happening to be able to respond in non-intrusive ways, and having mechanisms in place to be able to address either directly or through partnerships or braided resources. And then lastly is really about getting to a place where you can make the work to pair housing and services in a way that helps families and youth thrive, making it last, making it sustainable across sectors, and having that infrastructure and collaborative capacity in place at your state and local levels. And we certainly know and see that each of your organizations and systems and agencies have incredible demands on you every day. And, there are the requirements of each systems or sector's mission, and there oftentimes is very limited capacity to connect across. And there are also some examples that we'll be looking at today that may give you some ideas for how you might move that forward more directly. So all of this really is a part of helping us look towards, how we use housing and services to change the story, to change the narrative of our work, and really ultimately change the possibilities and the opportunities by creating pathways for children, youth, and families that can move to a place of truly thriving, and really try to interrupt, prevent, or at least reduce the impacts of the various systems involvement, institutional settings, impacts related to system structures, race, housing instability, and really moving to a place where there are the housing and services and supports in community, with community, in the way that people need them, that truly create those opportunities where children and families are housed, they're connected to people, to places, services they need. Young people have pathways to bright futures, and that's what this work is in service of. And so we certainly invite you to kind of think about, what does thriving look like? Truly thriving. What does it look like when, when a child is thriving, when a family is thriving, when a young person is thriving, and really think about, what does that take? And so in our work today, and as you're hearing some of our information, hopefully that'll, just kind of keep that in mind. All right. So, in this work, we talked about connecting, getting to know each other across systems. And we know that a key piece of that is trying to understand different systems. And in a lot of our work across the supportive housing sector and the child welfare sector, it's important to be able to understand each system. And we would like to have opportunities to really learn each other's language, and the intersections can oftentimes really be challenging when we don't understand kind of the key principles. So we're going to talk a little bit for just a moment about supportive housing and how is really affordable housing aligned with services. It's an approach that allows for it really values home and connecting children, youth, and families and communities to that housing in a way that allows for safe, healthy, and economically secure futures. I think before we go any further here, I think this would be a great place to pause and share a poll, because as you all were identifying yourselves in the chat today, I think it's also helpful to kind of just take a look at the sectors that you all represent. And so maybe we can take a moment and complete a poll. So we have sectors of child welfare, whether it's public child welfare agencies or legal judicial, housing, so that could be public housing authorities or developers or nonprofit housing providers, supportive services for families and youth, which could, or housing services, research policy space, education, the homelessness response system. So we'll give it another moment here as we kind of get a sense of who is here with us today. Just give it another minute or another half minute or so. All right, I think we can end the poll. It looks like we have over 30% child welfare, close to 20% from housing, over 30% supportive services, close to 10% in the research and policy space, about 8% homelessness response, and also a few folks from the education space. You can see the results of the poll there. All right, so that really ties into what we're talking about today. We have folks representing different systems and different sectors. And in these different systems and sectors, we know that language really matters. And there might be concept or values or language and approaches that differ because of the different mandates or the orientation of the systems or the roles that are played. And while oftentimes it might seem at first glance or in an initial conversation that some of this might be at odds with one another, there's oftentimes opportunities to dig a little deeper, to better understand and actually find how systems coming together and the different approaches can actually be complementary. So, we know in the supportive housing space, supportive housing is affordable housing with services. And child welfare systems are really focused on protecting children, prioritizing positive outcomes for children and families, but with a real emphasis on keeping kids safe, helping them find long-term permanent homes with their family or with a family, and overall well-being for children, youth, and families. And in the supportive housing side, we often see it as an intervention. Housing is not often in child welfare seen as a specific service or intervention. Things like foster care or specific clinical interventions are, as opposed to a broader intervention that may include various services, as we see in supportive housing. In supportive housing, we often talk about thriving, child welfare. It's one of the goals, focuses on well-being. Supportive housing is really focused on, no barriers to entry, voluntary services. Child welfare, really talks about risk or safety. I would also mention here, oftentimes in the housing world, we talk about safety, and we're looking at things from kind of a basic housing safety lens, like, are all the outlets in working order for electricity, and, are the windows free of cracks, and, things like that. And in safety and child welfare is really looking at, our children are safe in their home, and families have what they need to be together. Supportive housing and housing resources are often focused on the long term, and child welfare is really more of a short-term, immediate intervention. And I could, kind of continue on, but I think really the point here is different systems, different sectors have different orientations, different mandates, different roles. So certainly in the chat, we would invite each of you to think about the sector or the system or the role that you play. And are there terms or concepts that you have found in your work that sometimes maybe are misinterpreted or used differently than another system or sector that you've worked with? Feel free to share any terms in the chat that you think about maybe being at odds between systems, and feel free to discuss with each other in the chat. So we know that, certainly preparing to move forward, there's a lot that happens in life. We all of us in our lives need services and supports at different times. We all need a safe and stable place to lay our head at night and to come together. It's really important to know where you're going to go at night, have your place, and to be able to get access to the things that you need in your community when you need it. And so I think that's a great transition point to Claire Anderson with Chapin Hall. And Claire and her colleagues at Chapin Hall have a wealth of information and research that they have done, and partnerships with jurisdictions that give some real critical insights to kind of set us up on the basis for our conversation today, some of the rationale and the evidence. So Claire, I'd love to turn it over to you.
Andrew, thank you.
Kind of move to the next section.
Andrew, thank you so much. And I think it's really nice to sort of lay out these different languages. What do we mean in supportive housing or housing? And what do we mean in child welfare? And to sort of line those up next to each other. And what you just said at the end as you're passing the baton to me is exactly right. I hope to bring today some evidence and rationale for finding the space that is collaborative and that provides a common language, or at least a common set of evidence and a common rationale for how and why housing supports and other concrete supports, along with a sort of a comprehensive service array, are of critical importance to thriving and well-being and preventing family involvement with child welfare. So I just want to start, since I'm going to speak a fair amount about concrete supports and economic supports, of which housing is a component. I just want to sort of level set we mean a lot of different things when we talk about economic and concrete supports. They come in many different forms, and we have evidence across really the entire continuum that when families have access, expanded access to, make use of economic and concrete supports, they do better. So just sort of a lay of the land here as we get started. I'm going to home in on housing, pun not really intended. So let's we're going to just go to the next slide that gives us an overview of what is, in essence, a little over 40 years of evidence around economic and concrete supports. We know that reduced access to economic and concrete supports is associated with increased risk of child maltreatment and involvement with child welfare. And we know that increased access to economic and concrete supports is associated with, there's a relationship, reduced risk for child maltreatment and child welfare system involvement. This evidence is consistent across time and types of studies, from natural experiments and relational data to gold standard randomized controlled trials. It's consistent over time. I've said about 40 some odd years. We see it consistent across mechanisms, whether we're talking about cash assistance, childcare, housing, healthcare, employment supports. And this evidence is actionable. We bring it to you today so that you can take action together, collaborate across systems, and with multiple systems to apply this evidence to create the context in which families can be successful. So we're going to talk a little bit more about ways in which you can access this evidence. I'll drop into the chat as soon as I'm finished a website where we have coalesced many of the resources that emanate from this evidence. We've also just published a systematic review of economic and concrete supports that I'll also drop a link for you to have as well. We conducted this systematic review with an eye towards, though not completely overlapping with, the standards of the Family First Prevention Services Clearinghouse, in an effort to show really the level of rigor that is possible when looking at economic and concrete supports as a service specifically. All of this empirical evidence from academia is really important, but it's also exceptionally important to understand what families say that they need. And the Children's Trust Fund Alliance and its Birth Parent National Network back in 2020 put together this logic model or theory of change for creating a child and family well-being system, and said, you know, we have lived experience in the child welfare system. Here's what we think we need. And not surprisingly, they start with federal laws and public policies that redress child and family poverty, meet children's basic needs, and increase supports through policies like paid family leave, earned income tax credits, affordable health insurance, health services. And you see in the next column, there's strategies of food, housing, education, childcare, transportation, healthcare, job opportunities, and social supports. So as you all begin to advocate or talk together or create strategies, please understand that you are undergirded by both 40 years of empirical evidence and by qualitative evidence from families, which is probably not a surprise to anyone on this webinar, but it's helpful to see it on the page and brought together and synthesized and translated for action. Oh, I'm not sure exactly why the slides just went away. If we could get them back up on the screen.
Hey, Clara, we'll get we're working to get them right back up.
No problem. We'll keep going. And I don't know if I pressed a button that made them go away. Okay, so I'm going to just advance it to where I left off. can probably pick up the pace just a little bit. Okay, so digging in, what does the evidence tell us? Here we go. We are actually beginning to learn more about the predictors of child welfare system involvement in a way that we've not been able to understand as deeply. On the right-hand side of the slide, in the dark blue, Kristen Slack's analysis from 2011 shows us that food insecurity and housing insecurity are core predictors, if not the strongest predictors, of investigated neglect reports. And on the left-hand side, in the lighter blue, we see that income loss, cumulative material hardship, and housing hardship are the most reliable economic predictors of child welfare system involvement. So if we dig in a little deeper into some of the studies, what we see is that a number of our major policies, when access is restricted or less available to families, there is this increased risk for child welfare system involvement. And we see that in reduced TANF benefits, temporary assistance to needy families, lack of access to childcare, lack of stable housing, which we're going to talk a lot more about, reduced income and negative earning shocks, reduced employment, a fund modeling study showing us that when gas prices go up, we have more reports to the hotline, and increased regressive taxes at the state level are all associated with increased risk of child welfare system involvement. And if we were to look at a few of the housing specific studies, we see that housing stress across a number of different mechanisms, homelessness, eviction, foreclosure filings, multiple moves, and inadequate housing is associated with increased likelihood of child welfare system involvement. We also see that housing insecurity is contributes to the risk of entering foster care for 1 out of every 6 children involved in a CPS investigation, and that self-reported housing instability in urban areas is associated with an increased risk for neglect. Evictions, we see that each additional eviction filing per 100 occupied units in a block group is associated with a 2% increase in child maltreatment reports, primarily for neglect. So looking at those together, we have a new language, I think, to understand empirically that housing instability writ large is a predictor, but each of the components of housing instability or homelessness is also associated with increased maltreatment or increased involvement with child welfare. If we look at the converse, where families have increased access to economic and concrete supports, we see this decreased risk, and we see that along these 4 categories that we've come up with here. The first we call macroeconomic supports, like cash transfers, tax credits, and employment. Concrete supports, where we see housing as one of them, but we also see healthcare through Medicaid, home visiting that includes concrete supports, childcare and pre-K. Public benefits, how much a state spends overall on public benefits, temporary assistance to needy families, and food security benefits. And we also see that when families do become involved with child welfare, that in-home services or differential response that includes economic and concrete supports also has this effect of decreasing risk. So really interesting sort of on the higher risk side, and now on the lower risk side, we see this effect as I started this conversation with you all. And we're just going to look at the housing and the spending so that you've got a little more granularity about how this operates. So this is Hank Pohl's study from 2021, an analysis of state spending on benefits. And you see in the blue box on the right-hand side, that housing supports and housing infrastructure development were part of the spending calculus in the analysis. And each additional $1,000 that states spend annually on this constellation of public benefit programs per person living in poverty. So universally for people in poverty, not specifically to an individual family, is associated with reductions in reports, substantiations, foster care placements, and even child fatalities. We do see the need for an increased investment at the onset here but an enormous return on investment. So each additional 13% that states invest annually in public benefit programs, which would total about $46 billion annually, would save up to about $153 billion over time due to reduced maltreatment-related costs. So let's look at a few studies on the upside that are specific to housing. This is supportive housing. This is a randomized control trial, so really the gold standard. Children of child welfare involved families who face housing instability and receive a supportive housing program that includes both a voucher and case management experience fewer placements into foster care, a lower prevalence of substantiations, and increased reunification. So I've mostly been talking about on the prevention front end side, but we see this effect on the reunification or time to reunification side as well. The HUD Supportive Housing Demonstration Program found that families with children at risk of removal who received supportive housing, which included the voucher and intensive wraparound, also found fewer foster care placements, improved housing outcomes, and less intimate partner violence. So we often talk about if we're looking at families who are receiving investigations that we see substance abuse, mental health, and domestic violence, and therefore we must treat clinically substance abuse, mental health, and domestic violence. I think studies like this and a few others help us to be more nuanced and understand these policy synergies that there are multiple mechanistic pathways by which we might reduce intimate partner violence or substance use that is creating the child safety risk. So just an aside there about helping us to be really thoughtful and nuanced in our set of policy choices. This slide brings home that point. States that expanded Medicaid saw a reduction in evictions, sort of a sharp reduction of evictions. So this policy synergy, that there are multiple ways and multiple policies that we can put into place that help us make holistic choices and decisions about where and how to support families to stabilize housing and to stabilize the challenge in a family before or during the time that it is becoming a child safety crisis. So just a couple of examples here. We have, and I like to frame these as policy options or policy choices. Connecticut has a Head Start on Housing program. This is a cross-agency collaboration that provides federal housing vouchers to families with young children participating in Head Start programs. And we all know that young children are particularly at risk for involvement with child welfare. We also see family preservation with concrete supports. This is a really interesting study. Families who report difficulty paying bills prior to receiving a home-based family preservation program with concrete supports, providing food, providing clothing, furniture, supplies, or housing assistance is associated with a reduced likelihood of subsequent substantiations, and providing cash, clothing, furniture, supplies is associated with a reduced likelihood of subsequent foster care placement as well. So we're not just talking about confusing poverty or confusing the lack of housing with neglect and then investigating a family. Presumably when children are being removed from their home, there is a risk that is substantial. And we see economic and concrete supports having this effect on reducing foster care entries as well. In Illinois, the Norman program is a fund that is designed to provide concrete supports, including housing, to families, including security deposits, first month's rent, repairs, utilities, and other assistance and navigation to find housing as a strategy to prevent children coming into foster care. This is actually a requirement as a part of a consent decree to ensure that no family or no children were removed from home because of these core set of considerations, and creating a mechanism by which flexible dollars could be made available to address housing needs so that children would not come into foster care. We've recently surveyed child welfare leaders, and they too are very clear that more and direct flexible funds to meet the economic and concrete support needs of families would be helpful, and that we need a policy context that allows for shared responsibility and accountability across the public health and human services platform that is focused on preventing the activation and deployment of child protective services and the government's authority to remove a child from his or her home. So often we think of child welfare as the strategy to investigate families and child welfare leaders' intent on only focusing on safety as the primary thing that is occurring. But what we see is child welfare leaders being very clear about the need for shared responsibility and accountability, and wanting to bring together resources upstream and making those available through a variety of mechanisms so that families can remain whole and family unity remain intact. So I'm going to bring this section to a close and hand it back to Andrew for us to talk a little bit more about TANF specifically.
Yes, so Claire, we'll continue to hear from you in just a moment, but thank you so much. The evidence and rationale for why this is important and how this connects is so clear, and really I think sets the stage for moving some of the recommendations we talked about earlier forward. As we mentioned, we're going to drill down a little bit more into a few specific opportunities, 3 specifically. And the first one that we are going to move into is around temporary aid to needy families, or TANF, and really how TANF funds can be leveraged. So Claire, I'm actually going to invite excuse me, sorry, I'm going to invite you back to help kick us off around TANF. Claire, I think you're muted, sorry.
Technical problems, I apologize. So we're going to look at a few studies regarding temporary assistance to needy families, as Andrew just indicated. So this sort of follows the same thread. I'm giving you studies that are actionable. So we see that in states that imposed the total benefit loss as the most severe sanction for not meeting TANF work requirements, we see an increase in substantiated neglect reports, increase in foster care entries due to neglect, and increase in total foster care entries. And it's important to understand in the context of this study from Donna Ginther and Michelle Johnson-Motoyama that the first statutory purpose of TANF is to provide assistance to needy families so that children can be cared for in their own homes or with relatives. So this study makes clear that upstream decision-making in TANF has a relationship to whether or not children can remain at home. And we also know that states have unspent or unobligated dollars in TANF. We see a wide range of practices in retaining emergency funds or unobligated dollars in TANF. And in fiscal year 22, there was right at $6.5 billion across the states that were being held in reserve. Some states had zero, but some states had hundreds of millions of dollars, and one state has a little over $1 billion in unobligated funds. So this very interesting first statutory purpose and the relationship between decision-making and TANF and whether or not kids are able to remain at home is quite interesting, and I think a policy opportunity to dig into. We also see, again, that when state policies are limiting access to TANF benefits, that include reducing the maximum allowable cash benefit, and we've seen an erosion of that cash benefit over time in almost every state, implementing stricter time limits on receipt of benefits below the 60-month ceiling that's set at the federal level, or a lower TANF to poverty ratio are associated with increases in mothers' self-reports of physical maltreatment of their children. So a lot of what we've been talking about thus far is also about neglect. It's clear in the evidence that we're talking about not just neglect, but also physical abuse as well. And we see this sort of generally speaking, but we have a number of studies that are specific to physical abuse of young children, particularly abusive head trauma. And we earlier saw in the Hank Pulls analysis a relationship with child fatalities as well. In TANF, we also see that a 10% increase in the state public benefit level for a family of 4 is predicted to reduce foster care placements by about 8%. So what's the state policy option? The choices that states have is to increase TANF spending on cash assistance. We see that there are 15 states that spend less than 10% of TANF funds on that basic assistance, which is the cash that goes directly to families. And about 41% of Black children live in states that spend less than 10% of TANF on basic assistance. We also were talking a few minutes ago about the unobligated or in reserve dollars. You can go to this website at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and look and see spending over time and the extent to which your state has an unobligated balance. So what are some other policy options or an example of a policy option? In Wisconsin, the Targeted Safety Support Fund provides flexible dollars to families with children at risk of removal and addresses a wide range of needs, including housing insecurity. And the Wisconsin is using TANF dollars in part to fund this flexible fund pot, emergency housing assistance, furniture, utilities, and other expenses related to finding and maintaining housing.
Thanks, Claire.
So let's hear a little bit more about what's happening in Wisconsin.
Absolutely. So Amy Stetzel from CSH, who's been doing additional work specifically with folks in Wisconsin, is going to share a little bit more about insights from that work.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Claire. My brain is just spinning with lots of things, lots of great ideas and thinking. So thank you so much for presenting on all of this. So, Claire spoke to this flexible funding and all of TANF across different states, but specifically for Wisconsin. And I know we've got some of our friends from Wisconsin on the call today, but something that CSH was able to be a part of was this pilot program called Family Keys. Now, Family Keys used Family First Prevention Services Act funds to do this pilot, but what really kind of got them thinking was these, using those flexible funds. They were being used for a shorter amount of time, but they were like, what if we could have similar flexible funds and do this work longer and give families a longer amount of time to get stable, get into the housing they need, get connected to supports. And so Wisconsin used, like I said, the Family First Prevention Services Act funds to work in 3 counties in Wisconsin, La Crosse, Marathon, and Wood counties. And really the state said to those counties, hey, go and do what you think needs to be done to increase stability for the child welfare involved families in your community. And so families were allowed to be really, or communities were allowed to be really innovative with this funding. And they did things like build out a landlord risk mitigation program, provide additional emergency funding for individuals, pay for first and last month's rent, really being able to do things maybe they couldn't do normally, didn't have the dollars to do, didn't have the flexibility to do with other funding streams. So it's exciting to see what Wisconsin's been up to and been thinking about, and I'm excited to see what they do moving forward with this pilot as well. The other really exciting thing going on in Wisconsin is around their Medicaid program, specifically their CHIPS Medicaid program that's focusing on working with children and women who are pregnant. And so they have a housing support services, health services initiative, which is a mouthful. But really, this is about connecting kids and their families who are on the CHIPS program with housing supports, with housing navigation, with supports to keep them in housing. And so the state of Wisconsin has contracted with 8 homeless assistance providers across the state to provide those services to families who are on CHIPS. And if, I think some part of the push that we've been doing as well with our work is to say, hey, if you're Medicaid eligible, you need to get on the program, right? So you can have access to and draw down those federal dollars that better help connect you and your family to the housing that you need and keep you in housing. So really exciting to see states across the United States do some innovative things with their flexible funding. Specifically, this is speaking to the work that's going on in Wisconsin. And I believe, yep, thank you, Andrew.
Amy. No, very exciting to really hear about some of these opportunities related to TANF and then Medicaid, and to continue really looking more deeply at Medicaid. I invite Teresa Tenori from CSH to talk to us about some of Medicaid, what it is, and how that might be leveraged more directly.
Thank you, Andrew and Claire and Amy. And thank you to all of you out there that have joined us today. I really appreciate your time. Medicaid. So I'm really looking forward to kind of highlighting some of these, what's occurring right now in Medicaid, because I think it's exciting, and it really goes to how to fund some of these supportive services. So, but you might be thinking, why Medicaid? We have these major systems, right? Child welfare, housing. We've just talked about TANF, now Medicaid. These are big, complex systems that we're trying to get to know and connect with, which is one of our recommendations. But so why Medicaid? Well, couple reasons. One, it already funds a lot of the physical and behavioral health services that people in supportive housing and child welfare need and need to access. It's also considered a sustainable funding source. meaning that it's going to be there on an ongoing basis and can be there. So it's a funding source like maybe no other one that's available. And it can, and it does, and we'll go into this a little bit more, fund housing related services, which is amazing, right? 25 states have some type of housing related services funded through their Medicaid programs, which is great. And that includes 25 states plus even more states that have Medicaid's home and community-based services programs, which also has paid for housing-related services for quite a while now. But mostly, you know, why Medicaid? It's because of the access to healthcare and how healthcare can help people in the long term to increase their health outcomes. And I know kind of firsthand how stable housing can improve a person's health. After working a couple decades in child welfare, I worked in a Medicaid funded home and community-based program where an array of in-home services were available. And there wasn't a day that didn't go by where I thought, gee, if families involved in child welfare could have access to just a few of these services, it would make a huge difference. And now we heard it from Claire. There's research behind it that shows that, yes, this can make a big difference in someone's healthcare and housing stability. So states, of course, every state is different, and Medicaid and the housing benefit in Medicaid can show up in different ways in the states. It can be in their state plan. It can be in their section 1115 demonstration waivers, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more. It can also be in their section 1915, which is that home and community-based services that I talked about earlier. And it also in their managed care in lieu of services and settings section. So it's important to kind of know where your state is, and we have a state map that can help you kind of decide where or determine where your state is and what parts of Medicaid they're using. We have I'm going to talk about health-related social needs for a minute. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid, also known as CMS, about a year ago put out a health-related social needs framework. It was November of 23. And this was a huge departure from how Medicaid has been supporting housing services. Namely, rental assistance has become available. And many of you that have been around Medicaid for years know that room and board was always separated from Medicaid. They didn't pay for room and board. Same thing with nutrition or meals. They'd pay for maybe 2 meals a day, but not 3 unless they were in a hospital, right? But now they're paying for things like pantry stocking and 3 meals a day and some rental assistance, short-term rental assistance. But it's through this health-related social needs, which is part of what we're seeing, the 1115 waiver. Now, it doesn't mean housing services aren't provided in those other ways, but for this framework, CMS has really called out. We're going to put this link to the framework in the chat so you can see it. It's a short 3-4 pages, and it will show the different services in this framework, and then how the different authorities can be tapped or used to access these services. Important to the framework is this time around, CMS is also funding infrastructure funds or capacity building funds, which is also really good. This is a change in terms of networks, providers, and it takes time to kind of ramp up and develop these systems. And I think for the first time, CMS is responding to that by saying, you know, states can now, in this 1115 framework, access infrastructure funds, which are about 15% of their total, I'm sorry, I've got the wrong, yeah, their projected spending in Medicaid. So some of the things that the infrastructure funds are going for, you see these 4 categories on the left side, and that's pretty much all the states that have this funding, so they can use this funding towards technology. So if you're a community-based organization and you're just looking at Medicaid for the first time, you'll need some technology, or maybe your system talking to the Medicaid system, or how do you transfer a progress note into a billable occurrence. It has to be done through technology. And so there's some funding for that. Business or operational funds, which is making sure you have the documentation and the policies and procedures in place that will help you help support a Medicaid funded agency. Workforce development. So the training and making sure your staff, the hiring, the training, onboarding of staff so that they can be the providers of the service. Outreach and education. So you're reaching the members for Medicaid members, but also the clients that would need the services. So these are one-time funds. They're reissued every year of the waiver. A real call out to the state of Oregon, which has done a tremendous job of making sure these infrastructure funds are flowing to community-based organizations. And they just finished their first round of applications and are funding community-based organizations and tapping on some brand new networks of housing providers and nutrition providers in this area. So that's really cool. And I think this last slide I have is the type of services that that we see pre-tenancy. So helping people find housing is really important, and securing housing, whether that's through looking for landlords, searching just different ways of doing it through scattered sites, through buildings, transition and moving costs. Now, also that includes like security deposits, application fees, inspection fees, utility activation fees, any payments that have been in arrears, home modifications. So that means climate devices, grab bars, ramps, anything that would make the home safe for the individual and the families. And then, of course, individualized case management that's there, which is really important. That linkages to services is really key, whatever services it is. It's eviction prevention, it's tenants' rights. It's really providing the supports that families and individuals need in the long term. Let's see. I think I wanted to add two more things around the states have eligibility criteria that's unique to each state. And so it's important to kind of look at what the eligibility criteria is. And then the target populations. So two things that really differ across different states. But in terms of child welfare, I think we see a lot of older youth transitioning out of foster care. Many states are calling them eligible now. So hopefully that's going to be a seamless transition from one system to another, and accessing these services to help young people transition out of foster care. I think that's it on Medicaid. I could go on and we could spend days on Medicaid, but I know we have other things.
Thank you, Teresa. Yes, I know you and I have had numerous lengthy discussions about Medicaid, and there's a wealth of information, and we certainly encourage you all as an audience to continue to pose your questions in the Q&A area. You can find that on your Zoom toolbar, and we'll be back with Teresa and the other panelists in just a bit. So we're going to shift now to the third hot topic, or kind of policy opportunity related to services that we're highlighting specifically today, which is under the child welfare system through Title 4E, which and the Family First Prevention Services piece of things. So I will invite Claire back to share some additional information about Title 4E and Family First.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And yes, we could talk about Medicaid all day, and I can talk about Family First all day. So the Family First Prevention Services Act, as you likely know, allows states to spend 4E federal dollars on prevention. And since 2018, changes the flexibilities that are available. Historically, it's only been able to be spent once children enter foster care or are close to entering foster care. So this is a really important, relatively new 6 years opportunity for states to rethink their prevention service array and use the evidence-based practices that are on the prevention clearinghouse. But there also is new guidance from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that was released at the end of July, describing allowable services that can be funded on the administrative line of Title IV-E. So there's an admin line and a program services line. And this guidance indicated that peer navigation and additional referral and outreach and some concrete supports like childcare can be an allowable service. No, let me say that again, an allowable administrative function in Family First. So states can claim for these admin functions in a way that perhaps was not clear before this new guidance from the White House. So the Child Welfare Policy Manual at 8.6C1 was updated to clarify that peer navigation in support of participating in a 4E prevention program or service, if a child has a child-specific prevention plan in place, is now an allowable, claimable admin function. Referral to services, outreach, coordination of services, connecting families to resources, and in things that are designed to increase the uptake of the prevention services that a state has chosen. Childcare and transportation specifically are named in the update to the Child Welfare Policy Manual, and I encourage all of you to take a look. Housing is not named specifically, but these were examples that were provided, and I think it would be interesting to see a state submit in an addendum to its Family First plan or in its next 5-year Family First plan, a strategy around housing, and ask the Children's Bureau if those are allowable admin costs that are designed to support the child-specific prevention plan, support prevention of entry into foster care. So an important new opportunity here. I also want to talk just a little bit about the energy that we're seeing or the direction that we're seeing across the country in Family First. So back in 2018, when the legislation was first passed, we saw states primarily being very conservative and focusing narrowly on families who had been reported or were being investigated, or the investigator had the hand on the wrist of the child, imminently removing that child from the home. Washington, D.C. Was a bit of an outlier then and continues to be in terms of innovating, and we are seeing the country move in this direction. Over 20 states at this point are either conceptualizing or implementing what's being called a community pathway, trying to move as far upstream as possible to prevent maltreatment from happening, from preventing the activation and deployment of child protective services as part of the mechanistic pathway to reduce what's in the legislation, reduce the likelihood of entry into foster care. So I'll tell you just a little bit about what Washington, D.C. is doing because it's quite relevant in the housing and homelessness space. So they have recently been approved that children who are in families who visit the Family Resource Center in Washington, D.C. that is focused on the homeless population, it's called the Virginia Williams Center, are deemed categorically eligible for Family First. That intake and assessment is completed. Family receives case management and connected to housing and additional services by the Department of Homeless Services in DC. And that workforce in the homeless system is trained in motivational interviewing, which is a Family First approved, well-supported, evidence-based service. So this integrated relationship that uses Family First Prevention Services Act and the District of Columbia's Family First Plan, through a memorandum of understanding between the Child Welfare Agency and the homelessness housing system, allows for this really integrated and innovative approach, so that eligibility is really determined based on a family's need for services through the Virginia Williams homeless service system. Really exciting way to braid funding in the background, so that this is less about families jumping through individual eligibility hoops and more about the systems coming together to create an interwoven set of strategies, tapping various funding streams to make sure that families get what they need, when they need it, where they are, to prevent entry into foster care.
Thanks, Claire. I think, that specific point and example are really kind of tied together so much of what we've been talking about today. And so really thinking about the housing and services and supports and all the evidence and rationale that Claire went through, about how those matter, and really the return on investment in all the ways, whether it's, through the opportunity pathways for families and youth, but also even for systems, but also really looking at how might these resources be tapped into. How can the systems really not only get to know each other, but through understanding some of these different streams. And again, today we've only dipped into 3 specific policy opportunities. Each of these 3 start federally through, so TANF, Medicaid, and Title IV-E and the Family First, all through the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, but all through different areas of health and human services. And they often come down to states and communities, again, through kind of different funded through different silos, so to speak. And, so really those opportunities to come together and get to know each other, understand what are the things that are already being done, how do these systems work, what are the mandates, what are the constraints, but ultimately then leading to how might we try something, what might we do that might get to better outcomes, especially in thinking about that seamless integration or connections between the alignment that can create a very different experience for children, youth, and families to be able to stay in or to access and fully benefit from housing, to prevent or end child welfare involvement, to facilitate transitions from child welfare for young people, and certainly as they often may begin family formation for themselves as well, for all of those different scenarios, to have the supports that are beyond child welfare and really can create those pathways forward, pathways to thriving in ways that also really help each of these systems meet their goals and their objectives, and in service of the results they're looking for in the lives of children, youth, and families. So real opportunities to connect and learn, to work inclusively, really informed by the voices of families and youth, by the data that's really driving things, really getting to the root causes, the underlying challenges that are getting in the way of being able to bring services together, or to access housing, or the contributing factors kind of between these different needs. And being able to really leverage these funds and using them to operationalize programs like we saw in the examples in Wisconsin, like we saw in the examples in Washington, D.C., really creating pathways and in some cases, almost a no wrong door approach, using family resource centers, and interagency agreements as mechanisms in some cases for being able to tie some of this together in a way that serves families. And all of it, obviously that requires identifying the families and young people and creating that access when they have housing needs and service needs. So, being able to really identify quickly and move to action, leveraging the partnerships and the resources in a way that moves towards really kind of an infrastructure approach that can be sustained and really helps communities address and build build the capacity to collaborate. So just wanted to kind of go back through these. So what we'd like to do, kind of thinking about these recommendations and some of the information and examples and steps that you might take that you heard today. We want to open up now to, again, encourage you, if you have questions or thoughts for the panelists, feel free to share them. I know some have already, and so I'd like to invite our panelists today to come back online. And Kara Mergel, I think, is going to help us have a discussion around some of these recommendations and also address questions that came in. So
yeah, absolutely.
Kara?
Yeah. And again, I'd encourage you to drop any questions you have in the Q&A button. We do have a couple that can get us started. So a great question came in that says, do states need to amend their FFPSA plan to access the expanded use of funds? If yes, how long does it take for plans to be approved? Claire, I'm going to ask you to start us off with that one. And you're on mute. Yep.
That's a great question. I don't think states need to amend their Family First plan to claim those admin dollars. I would say it's not a bad idea to do so. Amendments, generally speaking, could move fast or slow. And I've seen both. It's important to know that you can amend your Family First plan at any time. And many states are coming up on the 5 years of their plan and are working on their next 5-year plan. So those opportunities exist today and are open for collaboration and advocacy on the part of the folks that are on the call. Certainly, anytime a formal question or a formal document goes to the Children's Bureau, there is a back and forth negotiation process, and that does take time. So it's not an automatic. And I would also point out that that there has been some tensions across the regions, where one regional officer might give one set of answers and another might give another set of answers, or a state reads the guidance in a particular way and has one interpretation, and the Children's Bureau gives back another interpretation. I do think it is appropriate to engage the White House, the Domestic Policy Council, on this new guidance, given that it's new. These changes were rolled out in a White House sponsored event. And so the extent to which there are questions or unresolved answers around interpretation, I would highly encourage states to take that route as well. Certainly it's more, if we're just talking about time, it's more protracted. If the initial answer is not exactly what you anticipate as an interpretation.
Great. This one's open for anybody to jump in. It was dropped in the chat a little earlier, but there's a question regarding what fiscal recommendations would come out of this. I'm going to interpret the question from an advocacy perspective. What could we be advocating for related to increasing funding for this work?
Well, I'll jump in on that one. The first word that comes to my mind is simple. These are complex systems for communities, for all of us to kind of navigate. And I think the simpler the requirements, the ways, and there's lots of things that can be done on an advocacy level, like data sharing agreements, making those easier to come by is one example, but simple. Making things simpler. These systems are complex, lots of requirements.
I would piggyback on that quickly and just add, I think the naming of being able to align and work across funding sources in guidance, in policy, in plans can go a long way in, with that explicit connection to really create the opportunities to connect the dots more directly and kind of talk about it. So I think, advocating for federal agencies to make even more explicit the permissions to and, where possible potential pathways to guidance. And then I also think as state agencies and state and local agencies are moving things forward to be able to include, again, direction or guidance, or at least explicitly naming the collaboration and alignment opportunities would be another piece.
Yeah, and I might answer I agree with all those answers. I might also answer in a slightly, not in a different way, but in an additional way. I think the evidence of economic and concrete supports that I've laid out, and there's so much more, and the examples that we're seeing across the country that show us the variability of choices that states make, begs the question of interrogating our policies and our policy choices. And in child welfare, whether we say it explicitly or not, the operating first principle is interrogating family choices. Is the family neglecting their child or not? Is the family working or not? Is the family using substances or not? Does the family have an untreated mental health challenge or not? And we rarely apply that interrogation lens on our own choices and our own policy choices. And I think what the evidence allows us to do is pretty rigorously apply that interrogation lens. We've created a policy tool, I'll drop the link in the chat, that allows you to take the evidence and the policy choice and look at the policies in an individual state and say, where are we? Because our choices are contributing to child maltreatment and involvement with child welfare to a degree. For some families, it's a little bit, for some families, it might be a lot. But what do we advocate for? I think it's also advocating for this interrogation of our policies in the same way that we interrogate the choices of parents.
Thank you, Claire, for that. That was going to be my question to you. So thank you so much for, I was going to say, you gave us such compelling and rich evidence for how this money changes lives and how it can save money for states in the back end. And states have excess money to use. So let's go after money that's already there. Right. So thank you for putting that policy tool in the chat. I really encourage folks to use the power that they have to seek out who those folks are in your states, and go after that. And Claire, my follow-up question to you is, what is Chapin Hall's next steps with this?
That's a great question. At this presently, we're mostly, continuing to disseminate this evidence. The appetite and demand for this evidence is unlike anything I have ever experienced in my 33 years of being involved in child welfare. So first and foremost, I think it's helping people to understand it and to contextualize it based on where their sphere of influence is. I think what's next for us is listening to groups like are on the call today. Where and how can we be more intentional about bringing this evidence to bear and helping individuals and states make choices based on this evidence? We're seeing that in many ways happening, but really we welcome and would encourage some pushing of us and collaborative decision making about where and how to engage individuals and leaders and communities around this evidence, help them make meaning of it, and help them decide what changes to make.
Great.
So thank you.
So we just have a couple minutes left. We're getting a few more questions on FFPSA. A specific one, a question that says, to use a service like motivational interviewing, if it is not already in the state plan, would that require a formal amendment? But maybe an amendment is not needed for peer supports. So I think generally speaking,
there is a difference there. Absolutely, right? So presently, to claim for an evidence-based practice, it has to be in your 5-year prevention plan and approved. I think there's some energy around asking the federal government for a different approach, which is that if it's been approved in any state plan, why do we have to, have our own separate? But that's an advocacy question. But presently, yes, if you're going to claim for an evidence-based service, it has to be on the clearinghouse, and it has to be in your 4E plan, and it has to be approved. Your admin costs are treated a little bit differently. States do a whole host of things as part of its administration of the program, and all of those things are not typically detailed in the 5-year prevention plan. Now, that's not entirely true for some of the named components, like states have to do continuous quality improvement, and most states delineated what that would look like. But even with that, that was at a really high level where you could discern, like, here are the 4 things that we're going to claim for, but there might be 17 things that are actually happening on the ground that are being claimed for. So there is a very nuanced difference. And I think we're in a new space, and states are going to have to communicate with the Children's Bureau and negotiate what does or does not have to be in an amendment or a revised plan.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think those are all of the questions. We got through most of it. There were some specific questions about Texas's FFPSA plan. We're working on getting those resources directly to.
Yeah, and I don't recall if Texas has a Family First, but this was a voluntary program, and not every single state has submitted a plan, and almost all have, I think. Texas is not, I'm looking at the table, and I don't think that Texas is submitted along with Alabama and Alaska.
That would make sense, Joy, why then you haven't heard of it. So it's a good catch. I think,
but you know, that's an opportunity.
Yeah, I think especially as, you know, with the updated guidance that comes out and as states are continuing to wrestle, you know, with what makes sense and what's possible, you know, I think there's continued opportunities to have those discussion with state leaders, and also to be thinking about the, you know, the Medicaid plans and waiver discussions, thinking about, you know, the state TANF agencies and, you know, what resources are there, and the, you know, the plans related to how state TANF funds are being used, and really, you know, aligning those along with a host of other resources, funding strategies across systems and sectors that we didn't dive deeply into today. So thank you all very much for your contributions today. Thank you, Claire, Chapin Hall, all the research and evidence that you've continued to elevate and lift up. Thank you, Amy and Teresa and Kara, for your contributions, for guiding us through and sharing during our conversations today. And certainly we want to thank Casey Family Programs for really helping to make today's webinar possible as well. And lastly, thank you to all of you who have joined us today, as well as those who will be viewing the recording later. And we certainly encourage each of you to think about what you specifically will do following, you know, what's one thing you can do, regardless of which system or sector, what seat you sit in, there's something that you can do. And we encourage you to email any questions or follow-up requests. The email is on the screen. Our website addresses are on the screen. We will be sending a learning guide that includes a link to the recording and some of the links that were shared today, and as well as, again, contact information if you would like to reach out to dig deeper. And thank you so much for your time today, and take good care.